Hello, my name is Peter Young. I'm a member of the Committee of 100, and I also run an investment bank. And I want to really welcome you to our 23rd Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings event that is featuring a presentation and fireside chat on the topic of Asian American workers, diverse outcomes and hidden challenges. I'm very, very pleased to have two of the co-authors of a McKinsey report with that title. That was just published very recently that goes through a number of very important issues related to what the barriers are and the perceptions of organizations as it relates to career ceilings. Before I introduce them, I just want to say a few things. First of all, the Committee 100 started this series about 3 years ago because we felt that although there are a lot of wonderful organizations who are doing great work in this area, Ascend and others, Leap, we felt that there was a role for a nonprofit organization with no biases to act as a collaborator, but also a convener of bringing experts together, including people from those organizations, together to talk about a variety of different topics. We've had professors present their research. We've had industry leaders in different sectors, whether it's media or entertainment or legal or others, talk about what the unique aspects of this problem are in their organization, in their industry, and their advice. And we've had millennials. We had one where we had 4 millennials just talk about what it was like as a millennial, their perspective. And then one where we had the parents from a couple of different Asian American ethnicities talk about how you raise your kids and how you have to change the way in which Asian American parents tend to raise and terrorize their kids, right? In terms of careers and so forth. That was, by the way, that was a wonderful one. I tell you, I really enjoyed moderating that one. It was just fascinating, right? But the whole idea is to bring to the audience different perspectives of educational. The last thing I would say is now we've started to pivot, starting from July of 2021, we've started to pivot towards action items. So we had a group of 120 people get together and say, where are the gaps in the whole process with regard to solving the problem? So the idea not to try to duplicate what's already being done well by certain organizations, but to find the areas where where there are gaps and to try to fill them so that as a collective whole we can do better. And I'll give a good example. There was a feeling there wasn't a common events calendar or a common directory of all the organizations that are trying to tackle this. So we created a social media Discord site, which has an events calendar, has a directory, but it also has discussion groups where if you're part of that social media site, you can join a group talking about government or about organizational issues or so forth, but also post articles and things that you think are of interest to the group. I'll make sure that all of you who are attending today get the link and get invited to that Discord social media site. I'd encourage you to do it. It's great. It's a place where you can post things. If you know of an event that you think people would be interested in, you can post it. It's a great way to help people convene. So with that, I'm particularly pleased with our two guest speakers today. They are both co-authors of the McKinsey report that I mentioned. McKinsey has been very active in the whole area of diversity, discrimination, et cetera, and very committed to doing the kind of research, but also taking the actions that would help to solve this, what is really a serious problem. It's not a problem for Asian Americans to get into good schools, but once they hit the middle ranks, it's a serious problem. And we need to find ways to solve this problem. So the kinds of issues that they're going to talk about is it appropriate to lump all Asian Americans together as a group and not distinguish among the ethnicities? Does a model of minority image create problems for Asian Americans? Is there this perpetual foreigner misperception that's contributing to the lack of professional advancement? And are Asian Americans experiencing lower inclusion and getting less support than other ethnic groups. And then they'll have some recommendations at the end about things that can be done to help solve the problem. The two speakers we have today, one is Kweilin Ellingrud, who is a McKinsey Global Institute Director and a senior partner of the firm. She has had many different roles, separate from being a successful partner at McKinsey. This is one area that the Asian American worker issues that she's been involved with the work at McKinsey. And she's had a very successful career focused on financial services for McKinsey, and of course has more degrees than one really should have in her life. Jackie Wong leads McKinsey's race in the workplace research. His publications, including research on representations and experience in the workplace for Asian Americans, and he has been very, very active in this area. And you will see that the two little ears that you see that are peeking above the bottom, that is Jackie's dog, who may or may not contribute to the discussion. Where we'll see what happens. So with that, in terms of procedurally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to my two panelists. They have some slides, about 10 slides that they want to go through that pull data and observations from their report. Their report is available for those people who want to download it. They can explain how you can get a hold of it. But they're going to go through and try to summarize some of the key points and findings. And being McKinsey, of course, a lot of it is data-driven, which is a good thing. But they will end up with some conclusions at the end. And that'll be about 20 minutes or 25 minutes. And then I'll have a fireside chat with them and ask them some questions. But we're going to make sure that we leave time at the end for questions from those of you who are in the audience. And unfortunately, the only way you can ask questions and using Zoom is to type in your question either in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And all three of us are going to be able to see the questions and we'll address them. So with that, let me turn it over to Kweilin and Jackie for their presentation on some of their findings.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. I think as Jackie and I embarked on this research, what we knew was that I think what all of us see and experience here in the United States, as you take the majority of the world's population and sort of disseminate that down to one racial group in our workplace, what we see, of course, is there's a lot of diversity within that. What we see in the broader workplace is what a lot of Americans see, which is there's a lot of high income, average Asian Americans, educational attainment is high, and economic mobility actually is the highest for Asian Americans of any race within the United States. That's the good news, and that's the headlines, that's the model minority myth that we often hear about. When you parse underneath that, though, when you disaggregate all of that diversity, there's actually a number of challenges. There's pockets of strong poverty. There are other challenges within subgroups. And to take the majority of the world's population and then compress it into this one average is really simplifying a very complex issue. And so we wanted to disaggregate that and really bust some myths. And so as Jackie and I thought about it, we wanted to share with you today 5 myths that we want to really get deeper into. And we'll use that as a way to start our conversation in our Q&A. The first myth is that Asian Americans are a homogenous group. I'll go through that. Jackie will talk us through Asian Americans are all doing well, something that you might hear from some of your friends or colleagues. The third myth that we want to bust together today is that Asian Americans are paid the same as their peers. They're already doing well, they have high-paying jobs, and they're paid the same as others, so what's the big deal? The fourth is Asian Americans don't have a problem getting promoted. And the fifth is that they're well integrated in the workplace. And we'll dig underneath each of these in turn. The first one, just to set a little bit of the context for Asian and Asian Americans in the United States, there are about 9 million people, just shy of 9 million. They grew over the last 20 years, almost doubled, and they will also double over the next 40 years to almost 9% of the overall population. So moving from 6% today to 9% over the next 40 or so years. And as you decompose Asian Americans across the United States, it's about a third, give or take. A third East Asian, about 2 million of which is Chinese, a third Southeast Asian, almost 2 million, which is Filipino, and then about a third, 2.4 million South Asian, about 2 million of which is Indian. On the right side, you see about a quarter of Asian and Asian Americans are US born, almost half are foreign born, but are residents of the United States, and then about a third are foreign born and holding a visa. So a much more international, global set of diversity than in some other racial and ethnic subgroups. Jackie, do you want to take us over to number 2?
Yes, and then Kweilin was talking about the model minority, right? The whole thing about how all Asian Americans are doing well, and what we did was we took a look at really where Asian American workers were in terms of occupations and the wages that they were earning. And what we actually see is there's sort of this U-shaped curve where there's a lot of folks who are, yes, on the high earning income side and with fairly large representations there. But there's also a lot of folks who are in the lower income wage occupations, right? Things like manicurists, pedicurists, things like skincare specialists, personal care workers, those types of folks. And those are the folks when you aggregate everybody and say, yeah, all Asian Americans are doing well, those are the folks that fall under the radar, and you don't ever then talk about the folks who are not only in occupations that are lower wage, but also occupations that are more, especially during this COVID era, right, essential worker type folks who have been very much affected by the pandemic, and also have a lot of things that are just working against them, right? Benefits, things around just the total experience of what it means to have a job, and how do you actually live and care for yourself and your families with that job. And so that leads to that kind of occupational clustering, as we call it, leads to a great variation in the income and poverty outcomes across these groups. And you see here, right, if it were true that all Asian folks are doing well, then we would see median incomes across all of these different groups within our Asian American population be around the same, and that's not the case, right? You see, you see the top here is your bottom 3 median income ethnicity groups, and then the bottom the lower 3 here are your top 3 by median income, and you see folks who are Burmese or Hmong or Nepalese tend to have a much lower average income than folks who are Chinese, Japanese, and Indian, right? And if you look at the poverty rates, same thing. There's a huge range of this, and it leads to the Asian Americans actually within that huge group of Asian Americans having the largest income disparity of any race group in the entire US. And so that's something that is just not talked about nearly enough, and it leads to folks who are just completely hidden from the whole conversation, because the conversation is about how all Asians are doing well, and that's not the case. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is that even amongst the Chinese folks here, right, we're talking about the third highest median income for Chinese folks. As Kweilin was mentioning, that group is 2 million people strong, right? The workforce in the U.S. About a third of the full set of folks who are underneath the poverty line within the Asian American community are Chinese. And so even within these these ethnicity populations, there is a wide range of variation in the outcomes of these workers.
The third insight is around high wage jobs. And as Jackie described, there is a bit of bimodal concentration, right? There's more Asians in low paying jobs and there's more Asians in high paying jobs. In fact, there's about double the share of the population in higher paying jobs that earn more than $100,000 a year. And that's the visible part that, many of our fellow Americans may see. What they don't see, though, is that even in those high-paying jobs, even in these jobs, the top 15 occupations we've shown here that make more than 100,000, there is a pay gap. So while white peers would make 100 cents on the dollar, and that would be wage parity, physicists make 66 cents on the dollar if you're Asian American, and there is a greater, almost double proportion of the Asian and Asian American US population in physicists. Surgeons make 67 cents on the dollar. Actuaries, 87 cents on the dollar, all the way up to pharmacists that make 98 cents on the dollar, but no occupational group across this top 15 actually makes full wage parity. So although there are more Asians in these top earning wage categories or occupations, there's still a pay gap, and in some cases, a pretty darn significant pay gap. 34 cents on the dollar is pretty significant, over a third in some cases.
And so when you take a look at the actual pipeline in corporate level jobs, and this is research that was derived from McKinsey's Race in the Workplace and Women in the Workplace research that we have. You look at this ladder going up from entry level in the corporate setting to C-suite executives, and the thing that we see immediately is that for Asian Americans, there's actually a higher representation of Asian American folks in these corporate jobs, right? If you just disaggregate corporate versus frontline, there's a greater proportion of Asian Americans than representation in corporate jobs. There's a lower representation in frontline jobs. But even here, and this is very much correlated with the look that Kweilin just talked about of wage and income disparity, the representation as you move up the ladder becomes lower and lower for both Asian men and Asian women, and the drop in representation that you see here from entry level to the C-suite is actually driven quite a bit by the decrease of Asian women representation along that pipeline. And so if you disaggregate that is a big part of the story here. The thing that we don't have here, and we've talked about this already, is just data, right? And we're able to look at the Asian population as a whole in the United States in these formats because companies are collecting data along these lines of like whether or not you are an Asian person rather than whether you are disaggregated within that Asian population. And so anecdotally, what we know is that within this pipeline, if you separate these by East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, the pipelines look very different. Where folks get stuck, and in general, the Asian population sort of gets stuck in this senior manager level, where then there's a big drop off after that. That changes depending on the disaggregation of the population that you're looking at. And a lot of that has to do with just the lack of promotion having for each of these levels going up. And again, it's very much seen in the Asian women population in the corporate realm. And a lot of that also then has to do with sponsorship. And this is something that we talk about a lot in the diversity, equity, and inclusion circles. Sponsorships, for those who aren't as familiar with the term, are people who are actively creating opportunities for people who are more junior than they are. So whether it's a direct opportunity like giving them a promotion, or something that's an indirect opportunity like putting them in a more challenging project so that they can build their skills, or referring them to other people who will also provide them with other opportunities that are beyond their current job description. That's something that we have found, and many other research entities have found, as very important for people's progression along the corporate pipeline. And what we see here is for entry level and managers, the effectiveness or the perceived effectiveness of sponsors is fairly similar for both Asian employees and white employees. But then as you move up the ladder, the more senior you get, the more likely it is that you as somebody who's trying to be sponsored feels that the sponsorship that you're getting is less effective than your fellow white employees. And so the difference between that also is correlated with a huge difference in feelings of inclusion within the workplace. And that's something that really impacts the trajectory of Asian American workers in the workplace.
Right. And what we often see and hear is both women and people of color are over-mentored, but under-sponsored, right? Lots of advice on how to walk the path, but no sort of sticking out your neck and creating the opportunity for me. And I think we all need a bit more sponsorship rather than just the mentorship. Insight number 5, very related to that, is around inclusion. And it's one thing to have the diversity at the table. It's another thing to have the inclusion. And when organizations shift from the diversity to the inclusion, what they find is that they're actually capturing the benefits of that diversity much more deeply. And so the benefits of diversity would be bringing true different thoughts and ways of thinking to problem solving, to a team meeting. We know that diverse teams both solve tough problems better and are more open to the idea that they didn't get the best solution the first time around. So they're more open to this notion of continuous improvement. So we want both the diversity and the inclusion. What we see here is that Asian and Asian Americans are not feeling as included as their white peers. They are less likely to say that my company recognizes my traditions and habits. They're less likely, especially East Asian, to believe that their company promotes employees based on merit. And when you don't feel like the system is fair, you're much less likely to want to stay at your organization in the medium to long term. You're much less likely to recommend your place of work to friends and family. And you're less likely to be engaged. And at the end of the day, we want engaged employees who are both diverse and feeling included. And so this gap in inclusion, as well as the gap in sponsorship that Jackie was describing, is leading to both, even if you have the diversity, less sort of value from a broader set of ideas and that engagement that we want in the workplace. So those were the top 5 insights that we thought we would highlight and just open it up for questions and discussion.
Why don't you do this? Why don't you go through this last slide, and then we'll do a fireside chat, and then we'll open up the questions. There are already some questions in the chat box, so we know that. Great. But let's do it that order. And I think these 3 things about what companies should do are very interesting. So if you could walk through that, that would be great.
Okay, we'll hit the highlights, and I think we've touched on a couple of these already. I think as Jackie described, if you only have the data at an aggregate level, right, there's only so much that you can say, but somebody who is a second generation, citizen is very different than somebody who's just immigrated and from a very different environment. So getting that granular data is critical for us to understand and sort of parse apart some of the challenges that we've been talking about, especially given this represents the majority of the world's talent globally. The second theme is exactly what we were talking about before. We need to address the inclusion challenges. If not only we are able to get our fair share of talent from this highly educated, kind of highly engaged set of workers in the workplace, and that will help us keep them engaged, but also make the most of those opportunities. And then on sponsorship, we have to shift from this, mentorship and trying to get the diversity at the table to true sponsorship and pulling that talent all the way through to the sort of vice president, senior vice president, all the way to the C-suite, and not just for men, but also Asian American women, where we do see that intersectionality having a disproportionate impact and even greater drop off in that talent pipeline.
Well, these are great suggestions. Let me, I want to run through a couple of questions for the two of you. First of all, we're talking about companies and corporations, we're not talking about government jobs and so forth. And it's what's very interesting is it's obviously a very complicated issue, right? Because everything from social pressures to corporate policies to all these things and racial preferences all mingled into all there, and so it's very hard to pull them apart. But if you think about the companies that seem to have made more progress with regard to helping Asian Americans succeed in their companies, what are the kinds of things that you think the companies have done have resulted in that?
I think I can start with this one. Just a better understanding of their Asian American population is a huge part of this whole thing. The companies that I have spoken with and worked with that have been able to do the most with this are the companies who actually understand that there is an issue because they have the data to understand that. Now, whether that data is qualitative data, right, anecdotally spoken to them, or just better understanding of people through things like focus groups and such, or is actually quantitative data that they're collecting, right? I know a lot of employee resource groups, or maybe not a lot of them, some employee resource groups that are Asian focused are starting to really get down to the nitty gritty of like, who are the folks who are in our employee resource groups. Those are the ones who have a better understanding of the problem itself within their organization and are able to then provide the kinds of tools and resources like sponsorship programs and whatnot that then can actually fix the problem. So that is, for a lot of corporations and organizations in general, right? Like, that is the start that they need.
Yeah. In fact, you make a very good point in what you just said, but also in the report, because quite frankly, a lot of companies actually just don't think there's a problem. I've talked to CEOs and they said, "Oh, really? Is there a problem?" And so part of the problem is they don't realize there is a problem, right? So your point about data is actually very important, because the data, to the extent that it illuminates that there is a problem, will help, because there are just a lot of companies, they don't know there's a problem, right? Kweilin, any comment on this issue of the companies that seem to have been doing better around this issue than others?
I think they both understand the problem and at a very granular level. So they will pinpoint where in the talent pipeline different groups are falling off. So East Asian men and women are dropping off at that manager level. What can we do about it? How do we go upstream and understand, where is that kind of pivot point or that choke point? The second thing is they're also driving this through accountability. They're not asking, what are the initiatives that you're doing? They're holding leaders accountable to improvement, whatever the baseline is, to improvement both by gender and race, and often in that intersectionality. I see the organizations that can improve this for women of color typically tend to improve this both for women and for men of color. And so I think that kind of driving accountability down to the line of business level, down to the function level, and then getting at that intersectionality can help, rising tide can lift quite a bit of boats.
Yeah. One way to think about it from a company point of view is that there's sort of at least three categories of areas that cause action. One is outside push. In other words, government regulations, things where they say you must do X, or you must have a certain mix on your board, right? By government agencies or say, the SEC, for example. So that's the outside push. The other is just inherently an organization just believes in it, right? So it's internally generated. It's not pushed by anyone. Just the leadership believes that it's the right thing to do. And the other is the push from within. So Asian American workers, then putting, shall we say, pressure on senior management to be aware of the problem and so forth. So where, when you think about the companies that you are involved with and the data that you've gathered, do you feel which of those areas seem to be working, and which areas really there needs to be more energy around in order to cause companies to do the right thing?
I've seen recently a bit of momentum on employees speaking up and saying we want to see more role models at senior levels, and where are they, right? We see a lot of diversity given educational attainment rates and sort of both university and master's PhDs. How do we see that progress beyond sort of the entry level or the first couple of levels? I think employee pressure and transparency there has helped a lot. I think the other couple of levers and other angles could help even further.
Mm-hmm. Jackie, any comment?
Yeah, it's like, yeah, I was gonna say very much the same thing. I mean, I feel like people don't often see that there's a problem until somebody makes some kind of fuss about it, and that has been something that more junior folks these days have been more demanding. And there's been some anecdotal, we did some interviews and focus groups around this, but there's just some anecdotal things around the nature of how folks are culturally brought up, and the amount of sort of resistance that people are comfortable with in the workplace, right? And so that, especially as Kweilin was talking about the changing shape of immigration to the Asian American workforce, we are seeing a large proportion of folks who are under 18 who are now going to become part of the workforce, who are majority U.S. born, and that makes a really big difference in terms of their own sort of understanding of what it means to be fair, what it means to have a workplace that is for them, and so on and so forth, and that changing sentiment has I think really made a difference in sort of what people are expecting of their workplaces and of their leaders. And there's a lot more people who are just recognizing that, oh wow, I actually don't see that many leaders who look like me in my workplace, and so they will ask the question as opposed to be okay with the fact that that is the case.
Yeah, no, I remember, when I went to investment banking after being in strategy consulting and private equity, there were very few Asians in investment banking and I was with, Solomon Brothers and Lehman Brothers, and, that's changed gradually. But I think, although we have a big problem, we also have to realize that some progress has been made, but it's been in different categories. For example, when I first applied to college, my alma mater only admitted 15 Asians, period, regardless of whether Asian Americans or not, per year for 10 years. And my sister, who went to this was Yale, was a year ahead of me. She went to the admissions office, said, it just cannot be that exactly 15 Asians are qualified every year for the last 10 years, right? There's 15 out of 1,200 new students. And they admitted it, and it changed. The next year was 30, which meant that allowed me to get in, right? And then it's quite different. But so there's progress that's being made in certain areas like the entry levels into schools and so forth, but we still have a ways to go. One of the things also I wanted to ask the two of you is your perspective and your recommendations related to companies, right, and what their practices should be. But the reality is it has to come also from within. In other words, you have to have actions of Asian Americans, and in fact, some of the handicaps are actually self-created, right? In terms of, when I grew up, my parents said, well, don't be aggressive, just put your head down and work and so forth. And that was, at that time, was kind of the that was the message, right? That Asian parents gave to their kids. And but that in fact doesn't work in a lot of Western organizations. So can we talk a little bit about what individuals should do themselves, as opposed to, it doesn't mean you can't get companies to make changes that will help, but what can you do as an individual to advance the cause and for your own personal cause, particularly for the people who are attending here, many of whom are probably in their mid-careers, trying to decide how they end up at the top?
Yeah. Couple things I think we each could do. One is to raise the question exactly as you're describing, right? It's an uncomfortable thing. You see it, you feel it, and then you decide not to say anything. And how do we each push ourselves a bit more outside our comfort zone to raise the question and start the conversation? That could be in a broader company-wide context on why aren't there more Asian American leaders in this group or that group or this non-IT group, for instance. That could be in a discussion. So when I hear, oh, so-and-so who happens to be Asian American doesn't fill the room. Okay, well, is that based on your cultural context? What's the actual impact to their work and their results as a result of that? Or is that from a very sort of specific cultural context? And how do we sort of de-bias some of the conversations and language used to describe people with maybe different cultural contexts and habits? That would be one thing. So I would say, open your mouth and raise the question, sort of force the conversation and be a bit outside your comfort zone. The second thing is we can each mentor and sponsor a few more people maybe outside our immediate sphere, but who are diverse, other Asian Americans, and we can go out of our way to do that. And I think those connections are even more meaningful. Sometimes they're across organizational boundaries or across in a different group. I think those are really meaningful, can be very meaningful relationships. And then third is both to ask for and give direct and tough feedback. What we see is that both women and people of color get less tough feedback in their performance reviews, particularly women, but women and people of color. And when we ask managers, right, of mixed teams, why is it that you're not giving this feedback? They respond, number one, I don't want to appear mean. And two, I'm afraid of an emotional reaction. But if you compound that across somebody's career, and if I'm not hearing the feedback I need to hear of, Kweilin, here's what you need to learn to run the business, I'm not going to be able to learn and grow at the same rate, right? With that same steep learning curve. And so both on your teams, deliver that tough feedback equally across all your team members. And if you are getting feedback, ask for that tough feedback as well. Those would be the three things I would focus on.
Jackie, any comments about things Asian Americans can do to help their own cause or the cause of others?
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to what Kweilin was saying is if you are an Asian leader, be a sponsor. I think that is one thing that, Peter, to your point around, like, we grew up with certain things that our parents are teaching us. And one of the things I know my parents taught me is that, like, I am basically out for myself. And like, I need to make sure that the things that I am doing are not in conflict with like what is successful for me or whatever it is that sentiment is. And oftentimes, for me at least, that has led to feelings of like, well, if I help somebody else, is that like a zero-sum game for me, right? And I think that's something that, again, anecdotally, we've heard from Asian American workers saying just like, that's something that inhibited me from being, from helping other people. And that's something that as you're, especially as Asian American leaders move up in the ladder, like that is something that we know helping others is something that that folks actually need. The sponsorship element is something that folks need to move up just the way that you did.
And you actually raised a good point, which is one of it is do different what ethnic groups actually band together to try to help their own group. And there's a history of that. There's some groups who had serious discrimination early on, like the Jewish community, for example. And yet at some point they said, let's band together to try to help our community. And they've done a wonderful job of helping each other, right? By the way, Kweilin, one of your McKinsey partners who was a panelist during this in this series made the following comment. Said, you know, the problem with Asian Americans, not all of them, is they tend to be very loyal to their families, but less willing to go and help other people who below them, whatever. And his story was, he said, you know, certain ethnic groups, they'll look at a mountain and they'll say to each other, let's help each other and get to the top of the mountain. And he happened to be Chinese American, and he said, well, you know, Chinese, they say, well, if you ever get to the top of the mountain, I'll say hello to you. So it was a great story. Well, there's a little bit of truth to that. It's not true among all Asian groups. I think Indian Americans are better at working together and helping people below. But I think, Jackie, your point is the right one, which is we need to find a way. And partly this program is an example of that. We need to find ways to gather together as a group and try to help the whole group succeed. And unfortunately, Asian Americans, with a few exceptions, are not so good at it, but we need to be good at it because, you know, again, if you don't gather together, try to help each other, it's a lot harder, right, to succeed, right? So now, the good news and the bad news is we have a lot of questions. We have 26 questions. So, which, by the way, we normally might have 10 or 15. So, so we got a lot of them here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to just walk through some of them. Well, some are really long here. Okay. Well, there was one question, which is whether these slides would be available. And I think the answer, Jackie and Kweilin, is actually you can get the whole report, correct? Yeah, okay. So we will send to all of you who are attending the link so that you can get it from the McKinsey website. So that's the easy question to ask. Okay. Are there, here's Jacob Zhang says, any corporate leadership development programs for Asian Americans available similar to ELC and HAC are for Black Latinos?
So, in fact, McKinsey has a Connected Leaders Academy that it actually started as the Black Leadership Academy out of a commitment that we made as a firm, and it's since expanded to both Hispanic Latino leaders and Asian American or Asian leaders, and so there's a program that is for more kind of executive management folks, and then there's a program that's more for up and coming middle management type folks, and so those programs actually help develop people's skill sets in their movement upward, and help with a lot of those types of skills that are important for leadership purposes. So if you have a question about that, or if you want more information, just let me know. Jackie_Wong at McKinsey.com. Happy to connect you with the right people.
And just to add, those are free programs as part of our kind of broader community commitment. So there's no charge for any of them.
Here's a question from Jim Chang, who says, how receptive have companies been to your report, and are they willing to do something about it? Of course, your report only came out in September, so it's only been a couple of months, but I know you've had other reports that have been released and articles before. Any comment about company reactions to the reports and studies you've been releasing at McKinsey?
It's been eye-opening, I think, for some folks. For us, and we even had to debate about this within internally when we were starting to write this. Like, don't we already know this information? It's like, yeah, we sort of do, but also there's like even more data now that we have to be able to validate some of these things. For the Asian American community that I've interacted with this report, the report and the findings have been validating, and that's the case oftentimes for any demographic group who looks at the data and like, oh, right, this is not just me thinking it, it's actually borne out of the data. For organizations that I've talked to, many of them are literally like, oh, wow, we didn't realize that there was a problem, to the point that, Peter, you were making earlier. But two, it's like, okay, well, no, actually, we do know that there's a problem, and now we actually have some numbers to be able to prove it to, some of the leadership, and we also now have some concrete steps that we can take internally to figure out what's going on with our own organization. And so, I mean, just looking at our numbers alone on how many people have actually been reading this report, this report's actually outperformed relative to what we thought it was going to be doing, because I think there's a good bit that's resonating with not only Asian American populations, but also the DE&I community as they are looking at more equity issues, because there's a lot of talk, obviously, about Black workers and Hispanic workers. And there's been less talk about Asian American workers, and it seems to kind of go in spikes. And we hope that this will continue the conversation. And we also hope that, more organizations will at least have a look at what the insights are and be able to reflect on what's going on in their own four walls.
Now, one question from Anthony Tompras. He says, when you did your survey, did you have a breakdown by immigrants, first generation, second generation? And I guess embedded in that, implied in that question is, did you see any differences as you looked at that kind of breakdown?
Yes,
and these are really good questions.
Yeah, they are very good questions. Good questions from informed readers, I guess. Yes, we did. And if you look at the full report, we actually do have more information on that. It is one thing that I think companies don't necessarily have a good handle over. And that's something that we actually hope to do a little bit more follow-up on the immigration piece. Our immigration numbers were similar to what the overall immigration numbers were in the US. I think it was more like 60-40 in terms of folks who were US born versus foreign born, as opposed to in the wider US, which was 25% and 75%-ish. But we did see in general that if you did the intersection of immigration, there in that sense, immigrants versus non-immigrants, if you did that intersection, that immigrant populations tend to have a lower level of inclusion overall, and then lower levels of inclusion in very specific areas that are different than non-immigrants.
By the way, in terms of your data, one of the things I did notice is when you were comparing South Asians and Chinese and East Asian and so forth, and whites, the perception of Indian Americans, South Asians, was that they didn't perceive as big a problem as the rest. And by the way, in at least two of the events we've had researchers who presented reports that said that Indian Americans did better than other Asian Americans, and why. It's a bit controversial. Not everyone agrees with their research, but it's very interesting to see that your data also suggested that they perceived that they have a problem, but not as big a problem as other Asians. Is that reflected in the other parts of the study at all? Or I know that was clear in that one chart.
Yeah, I think that's true around feelings of inclusion, feelings of fairness, but also representation in sort of higher paying in, occupational categories and some of the other charts. So I think it bears out actually in a couple of different aspects of the data.
By the way, Kweilin, I'm very, very appreciative of one of your charts where you looked at the high paying job, the disparity. I originally was a physics major at Yale. And it had the highest discount. It was like at 66 versus 100. Yes. So I'm very appreciative. That vindicated my move to finance. I feel particularly vindicated about my decision to change my major to economics, right? So one question, and it's about McKinsey, but also what it's doing to the outside world, but also internally. And this is Michelle Lee, is, what is McKinsey doing to resolve the issues of lack of promotion, unequal pay for AAPIs? And I think I'll broaden it to say not only well, to the outside world, but within McKinsey itself, right? Because obviously you're a large company and you have to deal with this issue as well. So, Kweilin, you want to answer that question?
Absolutely. I think externally, Jackie described some of the things in terms of creating the research, sharing the insights, but also talking with organizations about what they are doing and could do more of in a faster, edgier way. Internally, and Jackie and I are involved in a number of these efforts. One, we do look at the pay gap by gender and race. It's less obvious there because typically a certain level and a certain performance rating by definition gets you a certain pay. So it's less, I think, of an issue there. And it's much more around diversity and then promotion rates. And what we've done is disaggregated by Asian subgroup, as our recommendations would suggest, where the choke points are in that talent pipeline. And that looks very different, for example, for East Asian men versus East Asian women. And where do we lose that talent specifically, and what can we do about it to kind of both retain, deepen connections and sponsorship gaps, and get over that sort of promotion hurdle in certain key parts of the talent pipeline. So we're better able now, I think, to pinpoint where the challenges are, look deeper into kind of white space for sponsorship gaps, and then basically set an expectation for stronger, deeper sponsorship, not just across Asian Americans, but across our white colleagues and other colleagues as well, to kind of fill some of those gaps.
Yeah. We asked the same question of the CEO of Heidrick & Struggles, where they're in a particularly good position to have an influence. And he said, and by the way, he's Indian American, which he's the first Asian American to be head of Heidrick & Struggles. And he said, within the bounds of reasonable behavior, that they really try to influence their clients in terms of the decisions they make about who to bring on boards and who to promote as CEO and so forth. And and McKinsey has a role because it's advising senior management in companies around the world. You have an ability on the increment to have an impact that's very positive, right? There's a question from Julie Wong. So, and this is focused on Asian American women, right? Because you can clearly see there's also a gap, a particular gap between male and female. How much of the lack of Asian American women in senior leadership roles is due to social pressures of being caretakers from families, or versus not having sponsors, or not feeling they belong in these roles, or something else? Are there any insights as to why Asian American women seem to not do as well as Asian American men?
Yeah, it's a challenge. We have not kind of perfectly parsed apart what is sort of the social challenges and pressures versus other challenges. I will say that intersectionality of lack of Asian and Asian American women at the most senior levels is true across Black women, Latino women, and beyond. So it's not unique there. It seems to be that intersection of when you are both a woman and a woman of color, it's just extremely, extremely hard to reach the C-suite. So about 1 out of 4 people who report to a CEO across US companies is a woman. 1 out of 25 is either an Asian, Black, or Latina woman, all added together. So it's not just an Asian American woman issue, it's a woman of color issue more broadly. I would say it's probably exacerbated by a lot of the social pressures, not just the caretaker pressure. And in the United States, women do about 2.5 times as much unpaid care work as men, which is taking care of parents, in-laws, children, cooking, cleaning, etc. And so that average certainly doesn't help. But there's also the greater social pressure of what are the expectations of an Asian American woman in society in terms of having a strong opinion, raising your voice, sort of showing your leadership. And this notion, this societally ingrained notion that leadership looks often white, male, often tall, right? And so when you ask people to even kind of look at an exactly identical resume, and one is a John Doe versus Jane Doe, and those bullet points, the font size, everything is identical, both men and women will say, I think this male leader, this imaginary male leader, is a better leader, and I see higher future potential. And so we've got this sort of ingrained notions of leadership that are both by gender and race are challenging, I think, for Asian and Asian American women, unfortunately.
So Michelle Lee has a question. She says, how effective do you think lawsuits of racial related to racial and sex discrimination can drive change? I think it's a good question, and broaden it to not just legal suits, but legislative and other actions, right, as well, right? It's going through the government or the legal process. Any comments?
I like that as an option. Jackie would love to hear any of your thoughts, right? So when California says across the board, right, here's the new law, we see this globally with quotas oftentimes. Quotas do move the needle, and they move it much more quickly than often other things would have moved otherwise. So I think legislative action, laws changing, moves things pretty much as quickly as we have seen, especially in elements of diversity and inclusion. On the lawsuit side, EEOC, other sort of levers, if you will, that would probably be not quite as quick as sort of the legislative action or the laws changing, but probably, faster than not, and sort of moving in that same direction.
Yeah, actually, in terms of the EEOC, Cindy Tsai, who is the general counsel of the Committee 100, and I have been talking to some of the senior directors at the EEOC, and asked them if they could share two things. One, the data that they have, because they have tremendous data on this issue of discrimination in the workplace, but also what are the tools available to Asian Americans if they feel they've been discriminated in the workplace. So we're trying to work with them to see whether they could be part of a webcast and help educate our attendees on what legal tools are available for you to make sure that you assert your rights. So
Peter, on the topic of EEOC, I'll say if you get a chance to try to convince them to ask the question of East Asian, South Asian, Southeast Asian, that would be tremendously helpful, because literally, as maybe a lot of folks know, almost all large companies submit EEOC data on a yearly basis, and that's split by race. And the way that companies ask their employees to self-identify is very often along the lines of that EEOC data, because they have to submit it. Yeah. And so if there is literally the forcing mechanism for them to have that additional layer of whether you are an East Asian or Southeast Asian or a South Asian person, that changes the game quite a bit in terms of what companies actually are collecting in terms of data.
Yeah, and actually I commend Cindy Tsai for her reaching out to EEOC and say, let's have a dialogue. And then of course she then pulled me in, which I was very happy to do. And so we are going to pursue that, because we do think that's an important way to help Asian Americans understand what rights they have, but also what the EEOC can do to help this issue. Now, we pride ourselves on starting on time and ending on time. I'm going to blame our two panelists for the fact that we have 27 questions and only answered about 8 of them. And I apologize to those of you who asked questions that we didn't answer. But I do have a potential fix. I'm going to surprise the two panelists here. One of the things that we are going to be doing are a series of town halls where it's going to be less speeches, but more giving people the opportunity to really discuss and in groups. And we're thinking of starting a series around a couple of the key areas, such as corporate advancement, et cetera. And it's almost certain we'll do one on this issue of corporate and organizational advancement. And so I hope to have Kweilin and Jackie join as sort of discussion leaders. We have a technology platform I have been using, which allows people to, go from table to table and really talk to the people at the table. So now I put pressure on the two of you to say yes, but we'll try to arrange a time where we get a group of maybe 4 to 6 opinion leaders, and then invite attendees to come. And really, the focus is going to be having an open discussion, and not only about what the problem is, but also to think about how do we galvanize around solutions. So with that, first of all, I want to thank the audience. We had a really good audience here and asked lots of really good questions. And I want to thank Kweilin and Jackie for really sharing with us the key points from your report, and but also for McKinsey, because they've been a good partner with us. They partnered on some various things, and we're going to be partnering in an in-person meeting sometime in the spring, where we're going to try to gather people together to talk about the issue and focus on solutions, right? Because at the end of the day, it is very important to talk about what the data is and define the problem. But if you don't go on to say, how do we solve the problem, it's nice, but it's much less effective. And so we're going to start to devote more of our energy on, and we hope that a lot of you who are attendees will be part of working groups to try to solve specific problems. So with that, thank you very much, Kweilin and Jackie. I know, Kweilin, I think you're in Shanghai. Is that right now?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
we know that it's rather late where you are. So we appreciate the fact that you're that you participated at this time, and thank you, Jackie, as well. And we're just but you promised that your dog was going to present some PowerPoint slides, and you obviously have fall down on the job, right?
Yeah, I think he ended up going and playing with something else instead. So that's
You found something more interesting to do, right?
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all, and for joining us. And we wish you all a happy holiday season coming up.